I have a rendezvous with death. We'll preserve the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
No fear. No political correctness. No wokeism. You're listening to Underground USA.
Senator Bernie Sanders, the self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist from Vermont, who's literally never held a private sector job in his life, has spent the past few months crisscrossing the United States, rallying against what he calls an oligarchy, threatening American democracy. This is an obvious exercise in projection. From Omaha, Nebraska, to Iowa City, Iowa, and now targeting Republican-held congressional districts in Wisconsin ahead of a pivotal state Supreme Court election in April of 2025, Sanders has positioned himself as the torchbearer of a progressive resistance. His Fighting Oligarchy tour has drawn significant attention from the rudderless far left, with viewership often reaching six figures and a recent video amassing nearly 3 million views. Sanders' neo-Marxist message resonates with a segment of the far and radical left, emboldened by former President Joe Biden's farewell address, in which he warned of an oligarchy taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that endangers democracy itself. Yet, beneath the propagandistic fervor and viral optics lies a deeply flawed ideology, democratic socialism, as championed by Sanders. His campaign against oligarchy, his critiques of the Trump administration's billionaire-heavy roster, and his attacks on policies like the 2017 tax cuts and the cuts from Elon Musk's run Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, reveal not a coherent vision for America, but a patchwork of economic fallacies, political opportunism, and moral posturing. Sanders' rhetoric and ideology, along with democratic socialism as a whole, are not only impractical, but also disingenuous, relying on exaggerated class warfare narratives that fail to withstand scrutiny. Sanders' self-identification as a democratic socialist invites immediate skepticism when one examines the term's historical and practical implications. Democratic socialism, in theory, seeks to blend socialist economic principles, centralized control of production, wealth redistribution, and the abolition of private profit motives, with democratic governance. Yet Sanders' vision of this ideology often veers into a muddled hybrid, neither fully socialist nor pragmatically democratic, raising questions about its intellectual coherence. Historically, socialism has been associated with state ownership of the means of production, as seen in the Soviet Union or Maoist China, where economic centralization led to inefficiency, stagnation, and authoritarianism. Sanders distanced himself from these examples, pointing instead to Scandinavian countries like Denmark or Sweden as models. However, these nations are not socialist in the traditional sense. They are market economies with robust welfare states, high taxes, and private enterprise thriving alongside significant government intervention. Danish Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen famously rebuked Sanders in 2015, stating, "Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy." Sanders' insistence on the Democratic Socialist label thus appears more as a branding exercise than a precise ideological commitment. This mislabeling matters because it obfuscates the policy debate. Sanders rails against oligarchy and billionaires like Elon Musk, Howard Lutnick, and Linda McMahon, who populate the Trump administration, yet his solutions, massive government expansion, wealth taxes, and nationalized industries like healthcare, do not align with the flexible, market-driven systems he claims to admire in Scandinavia. Instead, they echo the top-down control of traditional socialism, which has consistently failed to deliver prosperity without sacrificing individual liberty. His critique of the Trump administration's billionaire class, while emotionally compelling, lacks a clear alternative that avoids the pitfalls of centralized power, ironically, the very thing he accuses oligarchs of wielding. Sanders' central thesis, that America is sliding into an oligarchy, gained traction when Biden echoed it in his farewell address. The image of Trump flanked by billionaires at his inauguration, coupled with Musk's Doge-led cuts to federal agencies like the intensely corrupt and ideologically agendized USAID, fuels Sanders' claims that a handful of ultra-wealthy elites are seizing control of democracy. Talking with CNN's Anderson Cooper in February of 2025, Sanders called Musk's USAID cuts unconstitutional, arguing they bypass Congress's authority over appropriations. His Fighting Oligarchy tour amplifies this narrative, spotlighting affected individuals like former park rangers laid off due to National Park Service reductions. As an aside, Sanders is also dead wrong about the Doge effort sidestepping congressional appropriations. Doge is a repurposing of the congressionally funded United States Digital Service, an agency created under the Obama administration in 2014. The U.S. Constitution allows a president to manage the executive branch as he sees fit, including rebranding and repurposing without the need for congressional input or approval. But then a constitutionally illiterate Democratic Socialist probably wouldn't know that. But is America truly an oligarchy? The term implies a small, unelected elite governing without accountability, a description more fitting for Putin's Russia, Xi's China, and Maduro's Venezuela than a constitutional republic with regular elections, checks and balances, and, to the extent that it is, a free press. Sanders points to wealth concentration as evidence, noting that Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg collectively hold more wealth than the bottom half of Americans. This disparity is real. Forbes estimated their combined net worth at $911.7 billion in early 2025, but wholly irrelevant. Wealth alone does not equate to political domination. Consider the 2024 election. Kamala Harris outspent Trump by a wide margin, raising over $1 billion with support from progressive billionaires like George Soros and Reid Hoffman. Yet she lost decisively. Musk's $270 million in campaign spending, while significant, was dwarfed by the left's war chest. If money guaranteed power, Harris would be president, not Trump. This suggests that electoral outcomes hinge more on voter sentiment than billionaire checkbooks, a reality Sanders conveniently glosses over. His portrayal of Musk as a puppet master, pulling strings via Doge, ignores the broader democratic process that installed Trump and his administration, however imperfect some may consider it to be. Moreover, Sanders' focus on oligarchy cherry-picks data to fit his narrative. The U.S. economy remains dynamic, with entrepreneurship and upward mobility still possible, as evidenced by Musk himself, a South African immigrant who built his fortune through innovation. Wealth inequality is a challenge, but labeling it an oligarchy oversimplifies a complex system where power is distributed across elected officials, corporations, and citizens, not just a cabal of billionaires. A chief propagandistic cornerstone of Sanders' critique is the Trump administration's plan to lock in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which he portrays as a giveaway to the rich at the expense of the working class. In Iowa City, he argued that these cuts exacerbate inequality, funneling benefits to billionaires while slashing funds for Medicaid, education, and housing. This rhetoric plays well to his tunnel-visioned, radically leftist base, but the economic reality is more nuanced, and Sanders' alternative is much less viable than he admits. The Trump tax cuts reduced the corporate rate from 35% to 21% and lowered individual rates across income brackets. Critics like Sanders highlight that the top 1% reaped disproportionate gains, an estimated 20% of the total tax relief, according to the Tax Policy Center. Yet the cuts also boosted economic growth, with GDP rising 2.9% in 2018 compared to 2.3% in 2016, and unemployment falling to a 50-year low of 3.5% by 2019. Wage growth for low- and middle-income workers outpaced that of the top earners in 2018 and 2019 per Census Bureau data, contradicting the narrative of exclusive elite enrichment. Sanders' solution, reversing these cuts and imposing steep wealth taxes, ignores those trade-offs. Higher corporate taxes could deter investment, as seen in pre-2017 America, when companies hoarded cash overseas to avoid the 35% rate. His proposed wealth tax, modeled on Senator Elizabeth Warren's plan, would face practical hurdles: capital flight, valuation disputes, and constitutional challenges under the 16th Amendment. France's wealth tax, abandoned in 2017 after driving 60,000 millionaires abroad, serves as a cautionary tale. Sanders' economic vision promises fairness but would deliver stagnation, a lesson history teaches but he refuses to learn. Sanders' outrage over Musk's DOGE cuts, particularly to USAID and the National Park Service, exemplifies his tendency to prioritize pseudo-moral indignation over pragmatic governance. In Omaha, he stood alongside former park rangers, decrying their layoffs as evidence of billionaire indifference. On CNN, he labeled the USAID cuts unconstitutional, citing the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which forbids the executive branch from withholding congressionally appointed funds without legislative approval. Legally, Sanders has a minute point. U.S. District Judge Lauren L. Ali Khan's February 25 ruling suggested the administration's funding freeze potentially runs roughshod over a bulwark of the Constitution. Yet his broader critique falters when the understanding that DOGE actions are not aimed at ending funding, but weeding out waste, corruption, and outright fraud are considered. DOGE aims to slash federal spending by $2 trillion, targeting inefficiencies in a $6.8 trillion budget. USAID, with a $50 billion annual allocation, has faced criticism for waste, ineffectiveness, and now agendized fraud, all of which have now been exposed. Government Accountability Office reports have flagged mismanagement in its aid programs. National Park Service layoffs, while emotionally charged, reflect a broader push to streamline a bureaucracy that employs over 12,000 people with a $3 billion budget, yet struggles with maintenance backlogs. Sanders frames these cuts as an assault on the vulnerable, but he offers no serious plan to address the federal deficit, now at $36 trillion, or the inefficiencies DOGE targets. His alternative? Expanding government programs like Medicare for All, costing an estimated $32 trillion over a decade per the Urban Institute, relies on fantastical revenue projections and dismisses the fiscal reality that entitlement spending already consumes 70% of the U.S. budget. Democratic socialism, as Sanders envisions it, demands endless expenditure without a credible funding mechanism beyond tax the rich, a mantra that collapses under scrutiny when applied to a globalized economy. Sanders' latest move, touring Wisconsin's Republican-held districts ahead of an April 2025 state Supreme Court election, underscores his propensity for opportunistic political theater. Wisconsin, a battleground state, will decide whether conservatives retain control of its top court, a decision with implications for free speech, cultural Marxism, read wokeness, voting rights, and redistricting. Sanders' involvement, ostensibly to combat oligarchy, reeks of ideological and political opportunism. He's not just fighting billionaires. He's rallying far-left Democrats and targeting college students in a state where his 2016 and 2020 primary wins showcased his appeal, conveniently aligning his movement with partisan electoral goals. This pattern repeats across his tour. In Omaha and Iowa City, he targeted districts flipped by Republicans in 2024, urging audiences to pressure Republicans Don Bacon and Marionette Miller Meeks to oppose tax cuts. His grassroots veneer masks a calculated strategy. Energize the far left while sidestepping the national stage, where his ideas face sterner tests and exposure to their inabilities to work. Sanders' nearly 3 million video views reflect his media savvy, but popularity does not equal viability. His CNN appearances and viral clips amplify his message, yet they rarely grapple with the hard questions of implementation or cost, hallmarks of a propagandistic populist move interested in preaching and being seen as important and relevant more than governing. Sanders' crusade against billionaires like Musk, Lutnick, and McMahon drips with irony. He decries their wealth and influence, yet his own career, spanning 4 decades in Congress, has made him a millionaire, with a net worth estimated at $3 million as of 2025 per public disclosures, and all on a 6-figure salary. Think about that for a minute. His 3 homes, including a $600,000 lakefront property, belie the acidically Bolshevik image he cultivates. While not in Musk's league, Sanders' personal success within the system he critiques undermines his moral authority. If wealth concentration is the problem, why does he exempt himself from the reckoning? Moreover, Sanders' selective outrage ignores far-left Democrat billionaires like Soros, Hoffman, and Tom Steyer, who pour millions into progressive causes, including NGOs that we now know purposely interfere in elections in transgression of their 501c3 statuses. In 2024, they dwarfed Musk's contributions, yet Sanders rarely calls them out, exposing a partisan double standard. His oligarchy label applies only to those in the center and on the right, suggesting his fight is less about principle and more about political tribalism. The real peril of Sanders' democratic socialism, as well as that of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashid Tlaib, Cori Bush, and Greg Cesar, lies not in its immediate feasibility, or infeasibility, as it were. His policies face long odds in a divided Congress, but in its long-term implications and the destruction it would cause to the lower and middle classes. By demonizing wealth creators like Musk, whose innovations in electric vehicles, space travel, and communications have tangible societal benefits, including employment and all the trappings that come with it, Sanders risks stifling the entrepreneurial spirit that drives American prosperity. His obsession with wealth redistribution overlooks the role of private capital in funding breakthroughs that government alone cannot replicate. SpaceX's reusable rockets, for instance, outpace NASA's efforts at a fraction of the cost. And don't get me started on Starlink. Furthermore, Sanders' expansionist government vision directly threatens individual liberty. Medicare for all, free college, and Green New Deal proposals centralize power in Washington, reducing choice and accountability. Historical attempts at such scale, think Britain's National Health Service, yield mixed results at best: universal access, but long wait times and rationing. Sanders' faith in bureaucratic competence defies evidence of federal mismanagement, from the VA scandals to the Social Security Administration's $23 billion in improper payments in 2023. Ask yourself, besides the U.S. military, and this is only focusing on their performance on the battlefields, what does the federal government, or state governments for that matter, do better than the private sector? The honest answer is nothing. Bernie Sanders' Fighting Oligarchy tour, with its manufactured, propagandistic, impassioned speeches and bought and paid for viral reach, taps into genuine frustrations over inequality and political dysfunction. His warnings about billionaires in the Trump administration, cuts like those to USAID, resonate with a public wary of unchecked power. Unchecked power fueled, for the most part, by Democrat administrations and Democrat spendthrift opportunists in Congress. Yet his democratic socialism offers not a solution, but a mirage. Economically untenable, ideologically inconsistent, and politically opportunistic. An unattainable utopia tantamount to the false euphoria promised through a heroin addiction. Sanders casts himself as a modern-day Lincoln, battling for a government of the people, by the people, for the people. But Lincoln faced slavery, a clear moral evil. Sanders faces a messy, imperfect capitalism that, for all its flaws, has lifted more people out of poverty than any system in the history of man. His crusade against oligarchy disingenuously substitutes class warfare for serious debate, ignoring the trade-offs of his own policies. As he tours Wisconsin and beyond, Sanders remains a compelling voice, but one whose vision, if realized, would trade one set of elites for another with a far more totalitarian and authoritative cast of characters, leaving America poorer and less free in the process. Sanders' vision for American government is this: the Biden years, only 4 times more inept, invasive, and oppressive. When we return, our segment on America's Third Watch, broadcast nationally from our flagship station, WGUL, AM 930 and FM 93.7 in Tampa, Florida.
You're listening to Underground USA.
Wokeism is a threat to the very foundations of our great nation and to the very principles of liberty and justice. The goal of wokeism is to divide us, pitting Americans against one another based on race, gender, and identity. This ideology undermines free speech and open dialogue, which are the bedrock of our republic. It promotes censorship and cancels anyone who dares to challenge its extreme agenda. We must stand against this cultural Marxism and protect our constitutional rights. Say no to wokeism.
News, insight, passion. AM 930, The Answer.
You know, when last we talked, Frank, we were going to wait and see if Pam Bondi got the Epstein files, and then that kind of went by the by, and then the Oval Office thing happened. So what do you think?
Well, the Oval Office thing took precedence because it was more geopolitically important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know, so, I mean, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. You don't give up on the Epstein file thing. It's very, very important. But when something like that happens in the Oval Office, which I found to be incredibly disrespectful by Vladimir Zelensky, I mean, You do not come hat in hand asking for aid and then challenge somebody in the Oval Office. And Marco Rubio wasn't sinking into the couch. Marco Rubio was ticked.
Yeah.
He had been lied to for days before this meeting. Zelensky's people had said that the rare earth minerals deal was a go. They were going to sign it. The terms had been met. It did not include a security guarantee that would put U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine in direct opposition with the Russian military. It just didn't. And then in front of the cameras, Zelensky decides to try to pressure the President of the United States to say there will be security guarantees, which is tantamount to either, well, if you're not going to let us into NATO, then U.S. troops will have to come and do it. We want that.
Yeah.
Well, no. And you don't have the wherewithal, and Trump was right. He doesn't have the cards.
Right, exactly right. Well, Frank, you mentioned about having Zelensky would want to have U.S. troops there, but is there any scenario where U.S. troops face off against Russian troops, and that's not World War III? I don't get it. I think that's always what we're trying to avoid.
What people forget here, and it's either with U.S. troops having to have boots on the ground in Ukraine, or whether it's NATO executing Article 5 because Ukraine has been let into NATO, is that it's not just U.S. troops squaring off against Putin's army. China and Russia have signed a, hey, we're cooperative, anything you need deal. And that's especially true about what's happening in Ukraine. They've said it not only twice, but recently. Z reasserted this just last month. We stand with you, that's it. If Article 5 is invoked, or if U.S. troops get involved, we got your back. So it's not just the U.S. squaring off against Russia. It's the three superpowers squaring off with two of them on one side and the U.S. on the other, and a completely unprepared European continent standing with the United States. This is what happens when you don't actually put at least 2.5% of your GDP into your own defenses and say, well, we're covered under the American nuclear shield, so we don't really need to beef up our military. That's what Trump's been saying about NATO the entire time. Yeah, exactly. Well, there is a cavalierness, going on, I think, with Europe, and looking at this, this whole thing, that we can be tough about this whole thing. But you're right. I mean, they need the United States, and they do rely on it in the case of this terrible scenario. This is why Trump said, no, we're not going to do that. And if you don't want the deal that's on the table, then take your bag of tricks and get out. Yep. What they proposed and what Zelensky, and by the way, he said point blank, he will not entertain the idea of a ceasefire, and he will not sit down and negotiate with Vladimir Putin, who is the person he needs to negotiate with, point blank, period, dot. If you're not going to negotiate with the person that you're in conflict with, there's no path to stopping the killing. There's just not. Then you become the obstacle. And that's exactly what Trump says. If you don't want the Americans involved at this because we want peace, then you're not ready for peace and we're out. Yeah. What this deal would have done was twofold. It would have put American interests vested with an American presence in the country of Ukraine so that it would have been Vladimir Putin directly attacking the United States if he were to move forward into Ukrainian territory, which means a direct act of war against the United States because of the interests we have there. And two, it would have given Zelensky the wherewithal to rebuild his country without having to beg every other country on the face of the planet. Yeah. The deal that pays for itself, essentially. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, of course, Frank's with undergroundusa.com. And Frank, you've been making some pretty interesting posts about this whole issue with Zelensky, the Oval Office dust-up. But Zelensky, he might be being influenced by some others in this whole thing, don't you think? Well, he's not a deep thinker, that's for sure, because otherwise he would have grasped the concept that Trump was trying to float about having a U.S. presence through the rare earth deal in Ukraine. Right. The thing that would have prevented absolutely Putin from moving any further and stopped the killing in the immediate. He met with members of Congress who are what I call the War Hawk Committee before he went in to talk with President Trump and Vice President Vance and Marco Rubio and Trump's team, and discussed how he was going to handle himself in the media, also giving reassurances that the rare earth minerals deal was a go because everything had been negotiated out, which obviously we found out wasn't, because he switched the terms in front of the cameras. But the point here is, you've got to look at members of Congress who met with him in this meeting, who wanted to prep him before he went to meet with the president, and ask him why they're meddling into affairs of state when there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that gives them the authority to interfere in international relations. They're not tasked with that constitutionally. Mm-hmm. So what they did, what everybody at that table did, was a violation of the separation of powers. Whether they were Republican or Democrat doesn't matter. And the excuse, we were just trying to help, or we hold the purse strings, doesn't cut it. It doesn't cut it. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't have met with Zelensky at all. And unless there's a letter that goes forward, and a formal invitation going out informing the executive branch that someone's going to address Congress, he shouldn't have been allowed to talk on the floor of the House either. Because it's a violation of separation of powers. Mm-hmm. So pay attention to who was at that table, especially the Democrats who were seated at that table, because they didn't do Zelensky any favors by giving him a green light to go in there and do the bait and switch at the Oval Office. All they did was help to keep the meat grinder killing machine going, and that's exactly what this is, because the Ukrainians don't have the numbers. That's why they're forcibly conscripting people on the streets in Ukraine into their military. And if you've seen some of these videos, it's horrific. Mm-hmm. It's horrific. So we've got to see this with clear eyes. You can't just say, I stand with Ukraine. You know, I feel sorry for the people of Ukraine. Their government's failing them. They had an opportunity to stop the killing before by taking an agreement that was on the table that Russia had signed on to. You know, well, we don't know if they'll honor it. We'll take it and find out.
Right. No, exactly. You know, Frank, there's this narrative too that is sort of afoot that people are really trying to emphasize or create, I think is a better word. And that is somehow, because Donald Trump is not suddenly agreeing to everything Zelensky brought up at the Oval Office meeting, that he's showing fealty, literally fealty, to Vladimir Putin. They want to do this narrative again that Trump is a puppet of Putin. I don't think that that's the case, but the media and the Democrat Party elite and the left certainly want to make it sound like that because it feeds their own agenda.
Well, Rubio brought this up when Stephanopoulos was talking over him in a show that Stephanopoulos asked him to come on to hear his views.
Right.
When he said, how is President Trump placating Vladimir Putin? We don't give him any money. We're not giving him any weaponry. We still have sanctions in place against the Russian government because of this conflict. How's he placating him? By saying that he wants him at the table to talk peace? That's how you placate Vladimir Putin. The man has an ego, not Trump. Trump is a confident man. I'm not gonna argue that. But Putin has an ego that makes him an incredibly stubborn person. And then you add on top of it, and this isn't a dig at the Russian people, it's just a fact. The Russian attitude culturally, which doesn't accept no, and you need to handle him a certain way to get him to a place where he's going to be willing to compromise. Mm-hmm. Trump knows this. Biden did not. Clinton has no clue whatsoever with her reset button. That was just stupid. Blinken was an idiot when it came to understanding that. Mm-hmm. You know, so how is he being placated by Trump? And Rubio said this over and over and over again to Stephanopoulos. Oh yeah, we want to get him to the table to talk. If you don't even start talks, then there's no hope to stop the killing. And isn't that the freaking goal?
Exactly. Well, the word placate, like you're talking about with Stephanopoulos, that's used. It's like thrown out there. It's kind of like in a court of law where they say, well, no, I'll just withdraw that. But the jury's already heard that. I think that's the kind of thing Stephanopoulos and others are counting on, that viewers are hearing, Trump is placating him. And, one other thing, too, Frank, I noticed, something that's just a personal thing of my own, and that is in the Oval Office, when the president's speaking, even if you are a visiting head of state, I don't think anybody talks over the president of the United States in the Oval Office. I think that was getting way out of hand with Zelensky.
No, there are protocols, no matter where you are in the world when you're talking to their leaders, and when you're on someone else's soil, especially visiting the office of the leadership, you adhere to those protocols. By the way, the protocol for the Oval Office when you're a visiting head of state is to wear a suit and tie.
Right.
I know people roll their eyes when I bring that up, but it's a matter of respect. And when you don't show that respect, and he's not Zelensky isn't a first world leader. By the definition of the World Bank, he's a lower middle class economic country. That's not us saying it. That's a globalist organization saying it. So, if you're a WEF guy or a UN guy, eat it and smile. But you don't walk in when you literally have your hand out because you need someone's help, and then just say, well, policy doesn't apply to me. Protocol doesn't apply to me. I'm a world leader. Really? So you're that important, are you?
Well, the Europeans, Frank, are coming up with what they call the framework for peace for Ukraine. And right after the dust up in the Oval Office, Zelensky went right over to the UK to talk with the PM there, Keir Starmer.
Yeah, and this is where Trump critics need to pay particular attention, because what Trump achieved in cutting Zelensky loose, unless he came back to say that he would pursue peace instead of the maintenance of arrogant slaughter, was brilliant. The UK, led by Starmer, in concert with several other EU leaders, including the leader of France and the leader of Germany, said that they would be willing to put together a coalition of the willing of European nations that would spearhead the peace process between Russia and Ukraine to present a plan B to the United States for its backing. That would include this coalition of the willing putting themselves in harm's way should Russia violate that treaty if they sign it. So what did that do? It made the European continent step up to rearm itself, become self-sufficient in its defense, and take the lead in a conflict that's in their own backyard, without needing to say, well, the United States will take care of us. Well, we'll just say what we want to say until the U.S. military pays the price for what for the checks that we write. And it also keeps, now we get to say, no, Ukraine, you can't be a NATO country, because that makes us hypocrites over here in the United States. We put an embargo around Cuba in 1963 when Russia, the USSR then, wanted to put missiles in Cuba 90 miles from the U.S. border. We were ready to go to nuclear war over that, but we're supposed to tell Russia it's okay to have a NATO country with missile defenses on its border, close to Russia?
Right.
Now, that's why we don't want them in NATO, by the way, because it is a traditional conflict that's not going to go away because of the roots that go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Ukraine and Russia. And it's bound to boil over again. And if they're a member of NATO, Article 5 mandates that all NATO countries come to their aid. One person attacked, it's an attack on all. And that puts U.S. boots obligated in the ground to fight Ukraine's war.
Yeah, and there's no support for that, I think, generally among the American people. The war hawks, that's a different story, like you're talking about before. But I don't think people you meet at the grocery store say, "Yeah, let's send our troops over there."
No, and this is why the pressure that was applied through telling Zelensky, "Take your bag of tricks and get out," by the Trump administration was brilliant. Because now Europe is in the position of the EU leaders, this coalition of the willing. I mean, Starmer said it himself. He goes, this coalition of the willing, including the UK, if Putin were to violate any signed agreement, would put boots on the ground and planes in the air. That's a quote. This coalition of the willing, it indemnifies NATO and it dismantles Article 5, which would have started a global conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So, everybody wants to, I stand with Ukraine. Trump's an idiot. I stand with Ukraine. Trump's a war, he's placating Putin. These are shallow thinking people that don't think things through to the logical conclusion. They're not critical thinkers. They're social media drive-by, know-nothing button pushers. And we have to, social media is great. You want to see fuzzy kittens and stuff, or if you're responsible enough to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff so that you can understand what the truth is and what the truth is not. But if you're just going to sit there hitting the like stuff and then I'm with Ukraine because you didn't think it through, it doesn't make you an intellect.
Yeah. Well, it gives you some sort of, whether it's entertainment folks or the people that were trying to line up and protest J.D. Vance on his weekend vacation time, trying, I think, to go skiing, I believe. It's this, as you said, it's a very shallow type approach to it. Because it's a feel-good thing. Hey, I stand with Ukraine because it makes them feel like, well, I'm standing up for democracy, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very complex in terms of how this could turn into a global conflict, no matter what.
This idea that because I support Zelensky in the Ukraine, I'm supporting democracy is the biggest canard of all. The man has outlawed opposition political parties. He's jailed people who speak ill of the government over there. He's shut down whole religions down there, banning the churches. So where's the democracy in there?
Right.
Where's the freedom? Where's the liberty? Where? Show me.
Yeah, it's a different universe. And that actually brings up a good point. Speaker Johnson, I think over the weekend was talking about, Zelensky's either going to have to come around to all this or basically resign. Even Lindsey Graham talked about resignation on Friday.
Yeah, and that's pretty big for Warhawk.
That's exactly it. Exactly. So, I mean, is Zelensky the man to bring this home, or do they need somebody else who can actually do that?
How about a more definitive question? Does Zelensky have the temperament to be able to negotiate peace? Because he certainly didn't display it in the Oval Office.
Right.
If he talks like that to somebody who's an ally, imagine how he'd be talking to Putin.
Well, there was an interesting exchange. Well, number one, and I wanted to get your reaction on this too, Frank, and that is when Zelensky said you have these two big oceans. And you're not so afraid, or you don't feel things, but you will feel it soon. And I thought, what the heck is that all about? That sounds much more like it's not a threat per se, but it's like talking like you're going to get yours before too long. And I didn't think that was the right thing to say.
Well, it was an ignorant thing to say. I'm surprised he didn't use Schumer's term. You'll feel the whirlwind.
Right. Exactly.
That's ignorant speech. You'll feel it soon. We understand the threats of the world. That's why we're concerned about China, too, that nobody's thinking this through, because they're engaged in this whether you want to believe it or not. in their "we stand with you and in solidarity for in all you do, Russia" agreement that they signed and doubled down on last month. If a world power or a world organization like NATO decides to get involved militarily on Ukrainian soil, China gets involved, and now you've just initiated the global conflict that everybody's going, "Oh, I don't believe that Trump. I don't believe the World War III comment." Are you blind? Evidently so.
Yeah. This is such serious stuff, and it can't be just distilled down into a tweet or, some other hashtag or something like that. This is the most high level problem that we've seen in a very long time.
And it takes intelligent people to even achieve the simplest stuff on a geopolitical stage. What you don't need to do is get someone who's going to be argumentative when they don't have a winning hand, whether he understands that vernacular or not. Ukraine can't win this war. They don't have enough people. It's simple math. Mm-hmm. So the best way to maintain sovereignty over there is to cut their losses and remain a sovereign nation. And the only way to do that is to get Russia to stop with the fighting and the killing.
You're listening to Underground USA.
A free and independent media is the backbone of our great republic. So it's crucial to have media outlets that aren't influenced by big tech censorship or the leftist mainstream media complex. But that means supporting journalistic outlets that bring us the truth without spinning facts to push a narrative. For less than the cost of a cup of coffee once a month at Starbucks, you can support the free speech mission of undergroundusa.com, an independent, reader-supported, and sometimes irreverent podcast and publication that gives you the real story without the bias. Go to undergroundusa.com/UUSA. That's undergroundusa.com/UUSA to receive a 25% discount on an annual subscription, bringing every new podcast and article directly into your email inbox, circumventing the censors and fact-checkers. Remember, knowledge is power, and staying informed is one of the best ways to protect our republic. Go out there and seek the truth, my friends. Subscribe to undergroundusa.com today.
Before I go, I wanted to address what appears to be an irrational position being taken by a great many people on social media. That is the refusal to distinguish between the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. Vladimir Zelensky is the leader of the Ukrainian government. He represents the leaders of that country who, through his own words, as expressed in his disrespectful Oval Office performance, will not agree to a ceasefire and will not negotiate peace with Vladimir Putin. His words, not mine or anyone else's. Common sense, and I know that it's in short supply these days, mandates that two people who exist in conflict with each other resolve their differences for there to be any cessation of hostilities. That's just a fact, and anyone not accepting that basic premise is an ignoramus. One way to resolve conflict is for one adversary to overcome the other. In the case of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, any resolution would have to see one country winning the war against the other. As it stands, recognizing this conflict as now one of attrition, Ukraine cannot win. Let's do the math. At the start of the war in 2022, Ukraine's population stood at approximately 41 million people. Russia's population was approximately 146 million people. Russia had between 18 to 20 million people of fighting age. Ukraine's fighting age population stood at 7 to 9 million. In a war of attrition, considering math alone, Ukraine would lose by a ratio of a little more than 2 to 1. Yes, weaponry makes a difference, but occupation is the name of the game in war, and it takes bodies to occupy land. Then you must consider that North Korea has engaged its troops on Russia's behalf. Unless the West, read NATO, or Europe's newly considered coalition of the willing, which hasn't been formed yet, Unless they get involved with boots on the ground, there is no way Ukraine can defeat Russia in the conflict to reach that avenue of conflict resolution. The other avenue of conflict resolution is negotiated peace. That requires the two parties in conflict to enter into negotiations with the goal of ceasing hostilities. Read, stopping the killing and aggression. Zelensky has stated full-throatedly that he is uninterested in a ceasefire or negotiating with his adversary. So Zelensky, not Putin, not Trump, not Russia, and not the West, has eliminated this avenue for peace from their choices. Again, for the hard of hearing, you cannot have a negotiated peace when one of the parties in conflict refuses to negotiate with the other. That left a cunningly crafted third way devised by the Trump team, the rare earth minerals deal. This would have formally introduced the American private sector into land management in Ukraine. It would have created U.S. assets in those regions. Thus, an attack on those assets would have been a direct attack on the United States and an act of war on Russia's behalf. As I stated in an earlier podcast, Putin may be ruthless, but he's not foolish. He understands that the United States and its aligned European powers have identified his military's vulnerabilities through their actions against the Ukrainian army, and he recognizes that in the face of a U.S.-led or even NATO-led military coalition, he would lose unequivocally. So the impediment to peace is Zelensky's egotistical need to win the war when there is no possibility of winning the war without a global conflict ensuing. Zelensky's goal, it appears, is not peace. It is not to stop the killing. It is to win an unwinnable war. Which brings me to my point. Only the heartless don't feel for the people of Ukraine. We all want them to live freely under their own sovereign rule. But conflating support for Ukraine's leader with feeling for the Ukrainian people is just as inane as saying all Germans were devout supporters of Hitler during World War II. You can feel for the innocents in Ukraine without supporting the unwinnable war effort of the Ukrainian government. The posting of the I Stand With Ukraine memes and statements only feeds the Ukrainian war machine's propaganda campaigns. It only serves their goal that insists on more military aid, only to see that aid sharpening the blades of the meat grinder for its warfighters and citizens. To wit, when did all the people who want peace so badly become blind followers of the unwinnable war? Only the uninformed, the naive, the half-witted, and the ghoulish support the unwinnable war. Please, people, I beg you, do your homework before you just repost stuff on social media. When you do that, and you don't know what you're posting, or what it means to post what you're posting, you are feeding the propaganda machine that keeps getting people killed in an unwinnable war.
You're listening to Underground USA.
The foundation of our great nation lies in our unwavering commitment to freedom, and at its core is the principle of free speech. It's not just a right, but a duty to speak our minds, respectfully debate, and challenge ideas. Today, free speech is under attack by the forces of the deep state and the globalists. We must all do our part to protect free speech, for without it, we'd be lost in a sea of woke conformity and censorship. We have the right. Protect it.
If you like the podcast, please head on over to undergroundusa.com and sign up for our Substack. It brings every new podcast and article straight into your email inbox. And do your part to defend the Republic. Talk politics, current events, and even religion. with your family, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. When we have these conversations, we realize we've got more in common than in difference, and that frustrates the deep state balkanization machine that seeks to divide us into little tribal parts so that they can infuriate one part and infuriate another part and combine that outrage to form 51% in the next election cycle, thus keeping us at each other's throats when there's no need for that to be. We're all Americans. We need to start acting like it. You're listening to Underground USA. No fear, no political correctness, no wokeism, and intensely anti-deep state. My name is Frank Salvato.